everyone, my name is Natalie. Today I want to do the second half of my May wrap-up. First up we have a non-fiction book, and that is The Spectacular Sisterhood of Superwomen by Nicholson. This is basically a comic book history told through interesting female characters throughout North American comics, and it is divided into chapters. Each chapter is a decade, so it starts in the 1930s and then moves on to the present day. And with each chapter there is sort of general discussion on the trends of the era, some of the things that was happening in the comics industry, and some things in the social context that was mirrored in the comics and the way that the female characters were portrayed. The design of the book is really beautiful, and a lot of thought, I think, has gone into creating a really stunning book like this. With each sort of character that is being discussed, there's the name of the character, where it first appeared, a general sort of discussion about the character and the comic, and then usually an illustration of the character in question, and where you can find the character, so the comic. This book, I would say, I would mostly recommend as a reference book, because the text itself isn't really that, it's not deep enough to be enjoyable as a comics history, I would say, generally, if you're not super interested in the topic. And as far as the selection goes, one of my main problems with the book as a reference book is that there's a lot of obscure titles that you wouldn't actually be able to find very easily. So with each, as I said, you can see the where to read the comic. She mentions reprints and things like that, but a lot of these comics and these characters are not reprinted, so you wouldn't necessarily be able to find them if you're not looking through garage sales and looking through Comic Cons. It is a really beautifully designed book. A lot of it is really fun, and a lot of the characters are really interesting, but I would mostly recommend sort of checking this out from the library and glancing through the pages and look up what sounds of interest to you, rather than reading it cover to cover. Next is a book I've already talked about in some length, and that is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This is the story of Mary Catherine and her sister Constance, who lived together with their uncle in this old house. The rest of their family has died from arsenic poisoning, and the older sister Constance is suspected of having been behind their deaths. So the rest of the town is very isolated from them because of their fear and their suspicion towards Constance, and the novel itself deals with fear in really interesting ways, which I talked more in depth about in my video book review of this, which will be linked in the description. I thought that this was really fantastic. A lot of the themes that Shirley Jackson deals with in this novel are things that are reoccurring in her fiction, and she obviously likes writing about these things, like small town life, the idyll versus the reality, how fear can fuel decision making, and how it can spiral, the way a group can work as one, affect each other, and form a mob. So a lot of these things are really interesting, and I think you can tell this is late in her writing career. She has really perfected her way of telling a story when this was written. So it's fantastic. If you're at all interested in Shirley Jackson and you haven't read her, I think this is probably a good place to start to get a good sense of her amazing ability as a writer. She's definitely one of my favorite writers in general, and I really had a lot of fun reading this. So if you're interested in more of my thoughts, I will link, as I said, the video book review I did for this book down in the description. Next, I reread a book that I've also sort of mentioned in my rereading video, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is obviously the classic of Victor Frankenstein, a scientist who decides to create life, and he ends up creating a being that he only calls the monster. So the monster doesn't actually have a name. It is basically a cautionary tale against science and the dangers sort of embedded into the possibilities of science. And the book explores, I think, really in really interesting ways the ethics of scientific research, science that should be dealt with, that should be done with responsibility, and a lot of thought in Victor Frankenstein, spontaneously almost creating life and not thinking very far ahead. He is so obsessed about creating life that he hasn't really thought this through, and so very quickly after he creates the monster, he regrets it and doesn't really handle the consequences very gracefully. So I had a lot of fun rereading this book. I think that this book has a lot of interesting themes that makes this one of those really accessible classics. I enjoyed it both times I read it, and I think this rereading, I enjoyed the writing of Mary Shelley in a deeper way, and some of the things that she deliberately does with the writing, and some of the things that she sort of leaves out and uses the absence in interesting ways. For example, the actual creation of life is quite vague in terms of the experiment and what he actually does. So it would be easy to use the sort of the ideas of alchemy in the book and go the supernatural route, but she doesn't. She wittingly decides to go with the science and leaves it vague, which allows it to be always relevant in a way. I wrote a full review of this that I will link also in the description, where I go more into depth in some of the interesting things I think Mary Shelley does in Frankenstein, and some of the things that really stood out to me this time. But suffice it to say, it deals with ethics in really interesting ways, and responsibility, especially regarding Victor Frankenstein and the consequences that his creation of life has, and how that leads back to him, the contemporary society's ideas of science, and the fears that comes with grand possibilities and progress. Lastly, for the books that I read in May was Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. This is the translation by Lydia Davis. So this book follows Emma Bovary, who is, she marries a man called Charles, and she settles into this new life. She seems to be very naive at the beginning, so when she meets Charles, she's happy to have a new life, new possibilities, and a chance for real love. So she sort of throws herself into this relationship, and quite soon she realizes that she doesn't actually really love Charles. She had mistaken sort of her wish for a change for love of Charles, and so she becomes unhappy quite soon after the beginning of her new life sets in, and she is looking for happiness outside of their home. So to me, Emma seemed to be clinically depressed. She has apathy towards the world around her, to everyone in it, and even towards herself. Most of the time she seemed to be neutral to everything that is happening to her, and if she isn't neutral, she's in despair. Her happiness lasts for very short bursts of time, and she's always looking for something that will throw her outside of her own head. And to experience true love, all of her pursuits and all of her choices seem to be fueled by this wish to feel things strongly. And she does this by having affairs outside of her marriage. For one, the young man called Leon, she has a relationship that sort of is similar to Anna Karenina's relationship with Vronsky. Their relationship is sort of similar in the way that it starts as very blooming and then spirals into this, both parts being quite tired of each other. Emma is also sort of looking for happiness through other means, like using money very spontaneously and buying a lot of luxury items that she doesn't need or even really want. She is increasingly behaving in very uninhibited ways and is pushing against all of the constraints that she is feeling. This book sort of explores women's situation of the time in really interesting ways, both through Emma in her constant resistance towards other people's expectations of her and what she really wants herself, and also through the other women in the novel. So I thought that this book had a lot of interesting themes, and I really loved exploring those. I think the translation itself is also really good. I wasn't in love with Gustave Flaubert's writing style, but I think it grew on me the more I read, and that was one of the sort of the main reasons I didn't get into this in previous tries of reading Madame Bovary. I really ended up liking this book a lot because of the way that it explores women's lack of resources and agency in the sort of the 19th century, and also in the way Emma is portrayed. She is an incredibly unlikable character, and it's quite uncommon, I think, for having such a character in the forefront of the novel, to have her as the heroine of the novel. So those are the 4 books that I read in the last half of May. If you've read any of these books, I would love to hear your thoughts about them as always. I hope you're having a really good day, and I will talk to you soon.